Hello everyone, it is April and today I'm here to share with you unforgettable books. These are books that stay with you for one reason or another. As I was compiling these books, I really was able to narrow down what makes books unforgettable for me. And the first thing that makes a book unforgettable are incredibly vulnerable characters, incredibly, not necessarily likable characters, but characters that you are rooting for. And characters often going through a really hard time that are just showing you their hearts, their souls. So let's dive into a book that made me cry a lot last year, and that was Hamnet and Judith by Maggie O'Farrell. This is a beautiful story, a very sad story, and it follows Shakespeare and his wife and their children. Shakespeare actually did have a son who died quite young, which is Hamnet. And in this book, you follow the family, you follow the children and the events leading up to the day that Hamnet dies, and then the events that happen after. So yes, you follow Shakespeare, but more so you follow his wife, Agnes, and her history and her incredible grief. It explores how grief is dealt with differently depending on the person. And by the end of this book, I was just bawling my eyes out. And it took me a really long time to stop crying. The book was finished and 15 minutes later, I was still like, it was just incredible. What gorgeous writing. I loved this book. Next, we've got Cyril Avery from The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. In this book, we follow Cyril in the 50s in Ireland, and you follow him before his birth and right through his entire life. And it explores his experience being a gay boy, a gay man, living in Ireland, and how it was so very looked down upon, and his experience looking for love. It's funny because, that story in itself sounds like it would be incredibly painful the whole way through, and there was definitely a lot of pain, but there was a lot of joy and humor as well. Cyril and his friends could be quite funny. So I really loved this book in more ways than one. It was also a huge book. This is nearly 500 pages, but it was so easy to turn the pages because the whole time you're rooting for Cyril and also frustrated with some of the things that he does, but you care about him so very much. So I loved The Heart's Invisible Furies as well, and I often think of Cyril. Next is the book that made me feel known in my infertility and miscarriage journey. That is The Light Between Oceans by M.L. Stedman. I've talked about this book quite a few times on my channel. This follows a couple who are lighthouse keepers on Genus Rock in Australia. They have been struggling to have a baby. They get pregnant, but often lose their pregnancies, and it's really devastating. And you are right there with Isabel as she's going through it. And then one day a boat comes to shore. There's a dead man in the boat and a living and breathing baby. They take the baby in and raise her as their own, with a lot of ramifications to that decision. But I just felt like the vulnerability of Isabel in this book really helped me. People don't really talk. Slowly they're starting to get better at talking about infertility, talking about miscarriage. I'm very vocal, as I'm sure you guys know if you've been here for a while. But I find when people talk about those things and talk about the hardships of it, it can help you feel not so alone, not only known, but also not alone. And this book helps me with that. I love finding those kinds of things in fiction. So loved Isabel. I know a lot of people feel mixed things about Isabel, but she helped me so much. Another character I fell in love with and felt super mama bear vibes with. I wanted to protect this boy. above everything, Elwood in The Nickel Boys. This is by Colson Whitehead. This is about Elwood, who is a teenager. He's the most wonderful teenager. If you had a teenager like Elwood, you would be proud of how you raised your son. He has a run-in with the police, and the police falsely accuse him of stealing, and he is sent to the Nickel Academy, where many boys go. White boys stay in one school building and black boys stay in another school building. It's not a school, it's a reformatory kind of situation that is just wrought with abuse, and there are many children that die there and don't come back. The school will write their parents and say, oh, they ran away, when in fact their child actually died there. I read this a couple of years ago now, I want to say, and in light of everything that we have been learning about all of these Indigenous children in Canada, their bodies being found in unmarked graves all over the grounds of these residential schools, they are finding hundreds of children. I think about this book all the time, and it's really devastating. So this is important to me. I recognize that this is about Black children, and a school that actually existed, I believe, in Florida. But the way that I feel protective of Elwood, it always reminds me, this book always comes to mind when we learn more about the devastation going on across Canada. It's heartbreaking, it's infuriating, and I hate how the Canadian government and how churches have treated Indigenous people. Yeah, it's really devastating. All that to say, this book is incredible, really hard to read. This is another book where I was just crying and crying at the end, but amazing. Another book that, like, the characters just stay with me, and I just want to know what they're doing, and they were so vulnerable as well, was the characters in The Dutch House. This follows two siblings, a brother and a sister, who grew up in this house that's really elaborate, filled with all sorts of windows, really quite beautiful. Their father bought it when they were quite young and spent many years renovating it. And it follows them living there and losing their mother. Their mother left them, and their father remarried a woman who wasn't very nice. And it follows them at that time, but it also follows them in the present day when they're adults, and how they can be drawn back again and again to this place where so many memories took place, and they just feel really connected. We all have those places in our lives that we feel so connected. And I thought this was a wonderful exploration of sibling relationships and brother and sister relationships. I have a sister, but it still made me feel really known. And I just adored it. Really, really good. Last for characters that are incredibly vulnerable is Queenie by Candace Carty-Williams. Now, this can be quite a funny story in a lot of ways. It follows Queenie, who is a Black woman living in London, and it explores her on a break with her boyfriend. Her boyfriend has moved out of their apartment, and she thinks he's coming back. She thinks it's a break, but really, in fact, he has ended the relationship. And so she is having kind of casual sexual relationships with men who don't treat her with the respect that she deserves. And it follows her learning about her own importance and learning how to stick up for herself. And she's surrounded by these wonderful friends in her life. I absolutely love this book. Very triggering for me. from, you know, my dating days and some of the crap that I put up with that I shouldn't have put up with. But I loved Queenie so much. So those are the books that have absolutely stayed with me because of the characters and the vulnerability of the characters. The other books that I find really unforgettable are books that have reframed my mind about certain things or brought a topic to light in a new way. The first is Hood Feminism. Before reading this book, I would have called myself a feminist and had a very particular idea of what that meant. And after reading Hood Feminism, I realized that I had a lot of work to do, that women of color have been left behind in the feminist movement for years because we haven't been including things that women of color deal with all the time. And they're like bare minimum things. They're like having enough food, you know, violence in terms of gun violence. There are so many aspects of feminism that I never would have attached to feminism before reading this book. And this opened my eyes. I'm so grateful to it. I have highlighted this book so much, and it's definitely a book that I'll be rereading again and again. I would definitely recommend Hood Feminism, Notes from the Woman That a Movement Forgot. So good. Another feminist book that I think, you know, made a lot of people nervous. It's like sci-fi meets horror, kind of. It's The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. This was written in the 80s. If you read it right now, it's still relevant and prevalent, and the issues that this brings forward are still issues that women are dealing with to this very day. This follows a world in which women lose all rights. They can't, you know, have money. Their cards are denied. And the women that are fertile are taken prisoner, essentially, and used for their bodies to produce children, and those children will go to other couples, usually wealthy couples who have dealt with infertility, because we live in a world where infertility is on the rise. And it's about women's rights and the right to own your own body and feminism. And some people will say that this is not a feminist tale, that Margaret Atwood didn't make it to be a feminist tale. And I don't know if that's fully true, but I also don't know if it matters. Like, what always the intention of the author was. To me, this is a quintessential feminist tale, and it's so important. And, you know, it's dystopian, but it also feels so close that it could happen at any time. There are so many times that people are trying to move women's rights backwards. Very nerve-wracking. So I definitely say The Handmaid's Tale is something that sticks with you and makes you think in a major way, as does My Dark Vanessa. My Dark Vanessa follows a young teenage girl who goes to a boarding school, and she starts to have a relationship with her English teacher. And the English teacher very much crosses the line, and he takes advantage of her. Now, we follow her in those days when she's young, and then several years later when she's older, she has, you know, graduated, she has a job, and people are now accusing that English teacher, Jacob Strain, of having raped them, of having sexually assaulted them, and she wants to look back on her relationship with this man as being consensual, as being romantic even. And over the course of the book, you see how people are groomed, especially children, how children are groomed, and how hard it is for those children to look at the person who at one point they had so much respect for because of the grooming process, and realized, you know, that they were actually villains, they were actually predators. And I think this is the most important book I've read, and the most accurate book that I've read about the grooming process and the effect of sexual abuse on young people. I was blown away by this book. This is one of my favorite books of all time. Last is a book that made me rethink sexual assault in a different way, and this is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This is a nonfiction book written by a woman who is a beautiful writer, beautiful artist, and she was raped by Brock Turner. She went by Emily Doe for many months, and she was very much in the public eye. Like, this case was very much in the public eye. And after the case was over, and the trial was over, he was sentenced to like an incredibly light sentence. And she came out with this book and her story. So Chanel Miller explores the process of dealing with rape, like in the minutes, in the hours after the rape. She also deals with the process of like trying to get back like on with your life, and how difficult that can be for women who have been raped in and of itself, and then also women who go to the police and try to press charges. The police handling it, the nurses taking care of her, the media coverage, the trial itself, how it affects relationships. It is a gift to the women who joined a group of women who have been sexually assaulted. Nobody wants to be a part of that group, but there they are. And it's a gift because it really shows that you're not alone. And it made me rethink what sexual assault really is. If a woman is too drunk to, speak well, if they're falling, if they are that far gone, there is no consent. You cannot give consent. And I'd really never thought about it that way before. And it was really triggering for me and some stuff from my past, but so important. So I loved it. And those are some unbelievable, unforgettable books that follow me around in my mind and have shifted the way that I think about things a lot. I loved them all so very much. Let me know in the comments below what your top 3 unforgettable books are and why. I'd love to know, and I hope you're doing very well. Chat with you soon. Bye, guys.